Now, the US Secretary of State is in South Africa at the start of a three-nation African tour. Antony Blinken has visited Soweto and has been holding talks with South Africa's Minister for International Relations, Naledi Pandor. His visit comes as world powers have been vying for influence on the continent, with the US concerned that it's losing out to both China and Russia. Relations between the US and South Africa have reportedly been strained. The US was frustrated when South Africa joined 16 other African countries in abstaining on a UN resolution condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. With more on this, I'm joined by Arise International correspondent Faith Orr, who is in New York. Good to see you, Faith. And Mr. Blinken holding talks with his South African counterpart, Naledi Pandor. What's the substance of those talks?
So what is happening is that Blinken, lots of people are accusing Blinken essentially of being on a charm offensive in Africa and saying that he's only there to get African nations on side against Russia in the war in Ukraine. But Blinken says that's not accurate. That's not why he's in South Africa. He is there to discuss things like climate change, like food security and health, for instance. So he says he wants to help places like South Africa boost local food production, boost things like vaccine production, and that he's there to discuss how to do this in real terms. So not just another visit by another diplomat where things are essentially a talking shop, but actually a real concrete visit where things can be decided upon and the way forward and how the US is going to work with South Africa on these range of issues going forward.
Right, but I mean, on a broader sort of level, Mr. Blinken and by extension the Biden administration, everyone's wondering what they're actually after. Because, I mean, is this all about the African perspective on the war in Ukraine? Because the timing would seem to suggest this, or is it clearly much more than that?
So Blinken says that it's not all about the war in Ukraine. He was directly asked that, and he said his visit isn't about any other country or any other place. It's about Africa. He says it's because the growing importance of the continent. He noted that by 2050, a quarter of the people on the planet would be from Africa, and almost half of them would be 25 or under. And he says that the US is keen to work with African nations on all of these issues because things like, the post-pandemic recovery, economic issues can't be solved by countries individually, but they can if they work together. But I think it would be naive to think that the issue of Ukraine isn't going to come up. I mean, we saw that Sergei Lavrov had done a tour of Africa just last month. We've also seen other countering influences by Pelosi in Taiwan. So the US is on a charm offensive, even if it says it's not. And even if he won't publicly acknowledge it, you would safe to assume that Blinken will be happy if his visit there results in African nations who have previously maintained a neutral stance coming around to Ukraine's side of this war against Russia.
Well, absolutely. And Mr. Blinken also announcing or expected to announce a new US strategy for Africa. I mean, do we know the details of that? I understand it's focusing on things like diplomacy and development rather than just counter-terrorism.
Exactly. So while the exact details haven't been announced, we do know that the strategy will broadly outline a move away from military activity, which frankly hasn't had a huge amount of success. Despite the fact that the US has worked with some authoritarian regimes, the armed groups are growing and expanding their base. It simply isn't working. Now, what they're going to do is move towards more diplomatic efforts and also things like boosting food security, because that is a huge driver of conflict, as is climate change. Again, another huge driver of conflict. So they're looking at, education, focusing on these sort of softer issues, and that will help boost security overall. I mean, this is also what the Security Council of the United Nations wants to happen. Everyone there says that things like development should be focused on because military focus simply isn't getting anywhere. The US has also been criticised in the past for hugely understaffing its embassies on the continent. They just don't have the people there, they don't have the resources because it's all been aimed towards the military. But with this new plan that they have, these things should change and the funding should go towards the development, the education, health, climate change.
Faith, thanks very much indeed. That really is very interesting. Faith Orr, Arise international correspondent, talking to me there from New York.